Now, the Arabs were divided into northern kingdoms and some kingdoms that were in the south, but they weren't the South Arabian kingdoms, because the South Arabian kingdoms, right, the kingdoms of Saba, Kataban, Ma'an, Himyar, Hadramut, were not Arabian kingdoms. Himyar became Arabian afterwards because so much Arabian blood had been mixed with those kingdoms that it became Arabian. And Kinda, which was also in the south, was an Arabian kingdom. Then we had the northern Arabian kingdoms, the Qederites, the kingdom of Qida that we mentioned, the Lihyan. They used the Didanic language. This was in the area of Thamud today. So the area of Thamud and the cities cover a long time frame of about 1,000 years almost. And many civilizations came and used those edifices. So the Lihyanis were there, the Didanites, the Hagrites, the Nabataeans were there, and the Romans were there for a while as well. The Ghassanids, famous Ghassanids and the Lakhmites, these were the vassals and client states of the two superpowers, the Romans and the Persians respectively. Then the Nabataeans, and then the small kingdom of Hatra. We'll have a look at these. The Sabaeans were known as Saboe, and the Himyaris were Himrotai by the Romans. They are mentioned by the Romans in their books. These kingdoms, Kataban and Aswan in the south, all of them were highly involved in the spice trade. They grew rich on the spice trade. Their predominant way of living, mode of living, was farming, because they were on the edge of the monsoon belt and they managed to catch the water via dams, and that allowed them to do large-scale farming. But they are legendary because of frankincense and myrrh that would be farmed in those areas. And as far as Africa as well, places like Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, you can find trees. But the best you find was in the southern Arabian Peninsula, and it was all manufactured, and it was taken up north to be used in the pagan temples, like as part of pagan rites. Like huge quantities were burnt. And then when the Christians, they also burn it. They also burn frankincense and myrrh. We know the story of the 3 wise kings that went to visit baby Jesus, and they bought frankincense, myrrh and gold. After the whole area all of Europe became Christian, the percentage and the huge tonnage that was coming forth from the South Arabian kingdoms, it wasn't as great anymore, but still there was a great demand, because to this day Christians use it in their worship. So besamin is Hebrew for spices. We get the word balsam. The word balsam comes from the Hebrew word besamin. There's a lot of mention of the trade, the southern trade going up north in the Bible, and we'll give the quotes as the time comes. So let's start with the Sabaeans. The Sabaeans, as-Sabiyun in Arabic, they were there between 1200 BCE, so that's a very early date, and 275 CE, with this capital at Ma'rib. Now the Bible mentions the story of Sheba. The queen of Sheba was from that area, but nobody actually believed. Before we discovered these civilizations, nobody took the Bible account seriously, because they didn't expect a civilization of that early a date to be from South Arabia. We knew of the Sumerians, we knew of the Assyrians, Akkadians, and the Persians, but nobody had expected a fully developed civilization of that caliber to be in the south of Arabia. So, but now obviously we know that to be true. It's the biblical Sheba. So Saba is the biblical Sheba in southwestern Arabia. It's mentioned in the Bible in the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Muslims have their own story from the Quran regarding this, and it's cited by the ancient Assyrians. The Greeks knew about it, and the Romans writers from about the 8th century BC to about the 5th century AD, they were all aware of this entity here. Their leaders were Mukarrib, as I mentioned before. The style of their leaders was Mukarrib, not Tubba, and not Negus. Negus was from the Horn of Africa. The Aksumite leaders were called Negus. These were called Mukarribs. They were like priest kings, unifiers, and it was replaced by the title Malik in the 4th century BCE. Now, here's a Sabaean funeral plaque from 400 BCE. Right? That writing on there is the Musnad script, and it was used for over 1,000 years to write all forms of the different dialects of the Arabian language. Even early Arabic was written using this script before it was changed over to the Nabataean script, which we look at when we discuss the scripts. Here's a Bronze Age man found in Al-Baida. This is 6th century BCE. So you can see how advanced they were, their art. And he's wearing what the Yemenis still to this day wear, a fouta, an izhar. This is traditional dress for not only the Africans from the Horn and South Arabia moving up towards North Arabia, but the Egyptians wore it, the Assyrians, the Qederites, the Sumerians, and even today the Far East, they dress like this. The Indians, the Southern Indians dress like this, because this is like a universal dress. And certainly in areas of high humidity, like Thailand, they'll wear this. The Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, it's just very comfortable to wear, and it's the de facto dress for these areas. And cloth weaving and cloth was very expensive. Not everybody could afford it. It was very easy just to have one piece and that would cover you. And even the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in hadith, he had worn an izhar before. So in the Bible we have an account, I'm just going to read to you from 1 Kings. The Queen of Sheba heard of Solomon's fame and came to test him with difficult questions. She arrived in Jerusalem with a very large retinue, with camels laden with spices and an immense quantity of gold and precious stones. Having reached Solomon, she discussed with him everything that she had in mind, and Solomon had an answer for all her questions. Not one of them was too obscure for the king to answer for her. When the Queen of Sheba saw how very wise Solomon was, the palace which he had built, the food at the table, it left her breathless, and she said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your wisdom in handling your affairs was true. Then blessed be Yahweh your God, who has shown you his favor by setting you on the throne of Israel." And she presented the king with 120 talents of gold and great quantities of spices and precious stones. No such wealth of spices ever came again as those which the Queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. So this is the Christian account of the Queen of Sheba. The Muslims, we have a different account. This is the earliest account of the Kingdom of Sheba, as mentioned, because they didn't think it existed at that time. We didn't know anything from a day earlier as that. And regarding the dam of Ma'arib, the Quran says, "Indeed, there was a sign for the tribe of Sheba in their homeland, 2 orchards, one to the right and the other to the left. They were told, eat from the provision of your Lord and be grateful to him. Yours is a good land and a forgiving land." So God is talking about how he blessed them, but they turned away, so we sent against them a devastating flood and replaced their orchards with 2 others, producing bitter fruit, fruitless bushes and a few sparse thorny trees. This is in Surah Saba. So now we'll have a look at the Quranic narrative on the story of the Queen of Sheba. She's not named as Bilqis in the Quran. That's a name most probably taken from the Greek rendition of a particular name there. So when the Hopi was missing and when he returned, he said, "But the Hopi tarried not far. He came up and said, I have learnt something that you do not know, and I have come to you from Sheba with certain information. I found a woman ruling over them, and she has been given abundance of all things, and hers is a mighty throne. I found her and her people worshipping the sun besides God. Satan has made their deeds seem pleasing to them and has kept them away from the straight path, so they became misguided, so that they do not worship God, who brings forth the hidden in the heavens and the earth, and who knows what you hide and what you declare. God, there is no deity save him, the Lord of the great throne." So then Solomon said, "Soon we shall see whether you are telling the truth or you are lying. Go with this letter of mine and throw it down to them, then turn away and see what answer they return." The Nabataeans were a peaceful community of traders. Their government showed something akin to basic democracy, and one of the reasons for this was that they never had standing armies as such. They never had expansionist ambitions. They never had expansionist ambitions, and they never conquered any territory for the whole time they survived. They were highly skilled traders, and their trading posts were in Dedan, were in Al-Higra, even as far as some of the Greek islands, and I think in Egypt as well, and Gaza, their trading posts were. They were a highly organized community of traders, and they fell to the Sabaeans in the late 2nd century BC. Right? They date back also to the 10th century BCE. Texts from Karno refer to a number of important points on the caravan route, such as Yathrib and Gaza, where they had their trading posts. These are the only South Arabian people that talk about their trading in their inscriptions. Normal inscriptions, if they're imperial inscriptions, they're going to be about inaugurations and conquests, and when new kings come and projects and such. Or it's going to be graffiti by everyday people, and they normally talk about their love, their sadness, their life, the weather, their boredom, and things like this, or asking for prayers. They pray to their gods and rain down curses upon people and things like that. But the Nabataeans were the only ones that in their inscriptions they mentioned trade. They minted no coins and made no wars. Their caravans went as far as Egypt, Gaza, Syria, Mesopotamia and Tyre. Their name was synonymous in the area with aromatics, because even in the inscriptions we can see that they refer to aromatics as Nabataean aromatics. Pliny has a statement on them, and he says about them: through their territory, the transit for the export of the frankincense is along one narrow track. It was these people who originated the trade and who chiefly practice it. It is said that there are no more than 3,000 families who retain the right of trading in it as a hereditary property. Consequently, the members of these families are called sacred and are not allowed to be polluted by ever encountering women or funeral processions when they are engaged in making incisions in the trees in order to obtain the frankincense. In this way, the price of the commodity is increased owing to scruples of religion. So this is what Pliny has to say about them. Then we have the Qederites, Mamlakatu Qataban in the Arabic language. The heartland of the Qataban kingdom, the Qataban people, was Wadi Bayhan, with the capital at Timna at its northern end and Wadi Harib immediately west of Bayhan. The earliest reference are in Sabaic inscriptions. Native Qatabanian inscriptions do not seem to antedate the 4th century BCE. It was a prominent Yemeni kingdom in the second half of the 1st millennium BCE, when its ruler held the title of Makarrib, South Arabian hegemon Makarrib. So even he used the same title. Then we have the Hadramites. The Hadrami, the inscriptions from the Hadramite kingdom are scantier, so we don't really have much information on who the Hadramis were because of where they were based. But they were probably the most successful traders. It's because they were based close to the sea. They had access to a port, and stock goods were coming in from the Indian Ocean, and from there they would overland go through their territory, as well as frankincense and myrrh from those areas would travel. So they were considered the wealthiest of all the South Arabian kingdoms and traders. The lands of the Hadramaic people were probably the only lands where climatic conditions made for favorable growing of frankincense. Pliny wrote that the whole of the produce was collected at the Hadramite capital Sabwa on the eastern fringe of the Sayhad sands and taxed there before being handed over to the caravans that carried it to the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. Now we move on to the Himyarites. In Arabic, Mamlakatu Himyar. These were a people of predominantly Jewish faith. I say this is because the elite converted to Judaism at a date, and even though paganism didn't really leave them, they were known by their Jewish faith, and it was a powerful kingdom, and they managed to conquer the whole region, and they even use the confederate tribes of Kinda to do their work and move their expansion policy into Central Arabia as far as Riyadh and Yamama and places like that. So Himyar is the Arabic form of the name of a people who appear in the inscriptions as Hamyar. So again, the inscriptions talk about, the inscriptions always are in consonants, so the exact pronunciation of the name that they would have would probably differ a little bit from the way it's rendered into Arabic. And the Greek sources call it Homirati. They occupied the extreme southwest of the peninsula and had their capital at Zafar, a site some 9 miles southeast of present-day Yarim on the motor road from Aden and Taiz to Sana'a. The first appearance of Himyar in history is in Pliny's Naturalis Historia. This is the latter half of the 1st century BC. So they were quite late compared to the others. A short time later, the Greek document known to scholars as the Peripulus Maris Erythrae mentions an individual who was king of 2 nations, the Homerites and the Sabaeans. So here again we have the kings of Saba and Raidan. There's in a maritime manual also, Peripulus, they also mentioned, what I'm going to read. On the very last bay on the left-hand shore of this, the Red Sea, is Musa. The whole place teems with Arabs, ship owners or charterers and sailors, and is stir with commercial activity, for they share in the trade across the water, the African coast, and with Bari Gaza on the Indian coast, using their own outfits. 9 days further inland is Zafar, the metropolis resident of Karabil, legitimate king of the 2 nations, the Himyarites, and the one lying next to it called the Sabaeans. He is a friend of the emperors thanks to continuous embassies and gifts. The port of trade of Musa, though without a harbour, offers a good roadstead for mooring because of the anchorage with sandy bottom all around. So by the Byzantine and Sasanian period, they were masters of all South Arabia and styled themselves as kings of Saba and Durudain. An inscription dated 470, that's AD 360, enumerates the military campaign of certain Himyarite kings who advanced as far as Yabrin in East Arabia. So there were 3 or 4 main expeditions. One went to the east, one went to the north, and then one went, I think they got as close as Mecca as well through their allies, the Kinda. Jau, modern Yamama, Kharj, Central Arabia, clashing with tribes such as Murad, Ilyad, Ma'ad, and Abdul Qais. Last 2 defeated near Mecca. So there you go, between the lands of Ghassan and Nizar. Muslim sources such as Ibn Habib and Isfahani describe these events too, giving the names of the kings as well. The Himyarites appointed the Hujr clan of Kinda to act as deputies in Central Asia. This is the reason that this explains why the Kinda adopted the names as kings of Arabs of the highland and the coast, and why Hujr felt justified in styling themselves kings of Kinda. Tabari mentions amongst those who served the Himyarite king Hassan was Amr, son of Hujr al-Kindi, the chief of Kinda during his time. When Hassan led an expedition against the Jadis in Yamama, he appointed Amr as his deputy over certain affairs. Amr, son of Hujr, was a man of sound judgment and sagacity. So Tabari mentions this. Then we have Aswan, the ancient kingdom of Aswan in South Arabia, with a capital at Hajr, Yahir, in Wadi Marka, to the south of Madi Bayan, is now marked by a tell, which is an artificial mound, which is locally named Hajar Asfal. Once it was the most important small kingdom of South Arabia, the city seems to have been destroyed in the 7th century BCE. So the reason it's not well known is it was destroyed quite early on by the king and Mukarrib of Saba, Karib el-Watar, according to a Sabaean text that reports the victory in terms that attest to its significance for the Sabaeans. So here is a picture of here's a map of the South Arabian kingdoms. You can see Aksum is, even though it was an Ethiopian kingdom, and they did invade the South Arabia, and they got as far as Najran, and Abraha stayed and broke away and formed his own kingdom there. I didn't mention it here because the Aksumites originally had their base in Arabia. So we'll mention that when we mention the story of Abraha. But here you can see the Himyaris, the Katabanites, the Sabaeans and Hadramatis, their respective kingdoms. Here's another picture here. You can see Aksum on the left in Ethiopia and its area of hegemony in the peninsula, and you can see the Sabaean kingdom, you can see the Himyarite kingdom with Zafar, its capital, and Saba, you can see Ma'rib and the Kataban and the Hadramatic kingdom here. And you can see the Hadramites, they commanded the sea. From that side, Indian trade came that way. And they were in a good position to get trade from Oman, the area of Oman. A lot of trade came from that way. It would basically move down and then move up. And at a later date, when shipping became better, a lot of it would be shipped up along the Red Sea as well towards Aqaba and Egypt and those coasts. So then we move on to the kingdom of Kinda. Now this was an Arabian proper kingdom. These were Arabs, as opposed to the other four that we just looked at, which were not Arabs. The kingdom of Kinda was in the south, but it was an Arab kingdom. And it was a tribal kingdom established by the Kinda tribe. That was the main prominent tribe. And they immigrated from its homeland in Yemen. So at some point, all the Arabian tribes moved from the north down to the south, and then they moved back out again. Now, the earliest understanding of the Arabian tribes that we had is we thought they originated in the south. We're talking about, even the Arabs, the divide between the Qahtani Arabs, the original Arabs, and the Adnani, the Arabized Arabs. The Arabized tribes were mostly from the north, and the Qahtani tribes were from the south. But new research is showing us that they all came from the north, and the earliest Qahtani tribes went south, and then because of the Ma'rib dam breaking and other events, they were pushed back upwards again, and some of them went right back to almost to where they started from. So the Kinda was a tribe that had its homeland in the Yemen area, and then they moved up. Its existence dates back to the 2nd century BCE, so 525 CE to the 6th century. Its capital was Qaryat al-Faw. This is another city on one of the trading routes. It was a very rich city for its time at that time. And it's mentioned in the South Arabian inscriptions. And it had much interactions with the Sabaeans and Hadramites. And it had support from both, the patronage from both. And the Byzantine ambassador Nonosos sent to the area by Justinian refers to them as Kindeno. So it was known to the Byzantines as well. At one point, it even captured Al-Hira from the Lakhmids for a short time. So as they were expanding, they went as far up to the Lakhmids, who were a great power by Arabian standards at that time, because they had the patronage of the Iranians, and it even took Al-Hira for a while. Imru Qais, the famous poet, was from Kinda. Now we'll look at this character when we look at Arabian poetry, and he was the son of the last leader of that tribe, and his poetry talks about him wandering the desert and trying to reclaim his kingdom, unfortunately, which he wasn't able to do. Kinda had a history of moving backwards and forwards along through the Arabian Peninsula, and we don't want to get too much into the history of the particular tribes. We're just having an overview of them. So this is what we need to know here. And it converted to Judaism along with the Himyarites, because the Himyarites were their main overseers, their overlords, their patrons. So when they converted to Judaism, it made sense for the Kinda tribe, parts of it, or the elites at least, to turn to Judaism as a way of keeping its patronage. This is a head of a man from Qaryat al-Faw, 1st century BC. So you can see there's Greek elements here. The hair is Arabian, and the facial elements have Greek and Roman elements to it. And this is Qaryat al-Faw, what's left of it today. And here you can see a fresco on a wall, and you can see what distinctly looks like a Yemeni man, right? Or a South Arabian type of a man. You can see the face, even though it's kind of Roman Greek in its the way it's done, but you can see you can see the South Arabian eyes. You can see the style of beard. You can see the curly hair, and it looks like he's wearing something akin to what the man on the right is wearing of the picture. Now this is what modern tribes in South Saudi Arabia, they still dress like this, and most people don't know this, but in the south they do not wear what they wear in the north. They don't wear the thawb and the shmag and the igal. They tend to wear dress like this, and we'll look at pictures of this as we go along. So again, here you can see a fragment of a wall painting, and it's showing a Qedite king in the 1st century, and you can see elements of Greek and Roman culture on the image of the king there. And this was their domain here. So it was South Arabia and Central Arabia, all the way up to as far as the Lakhmites, or just before, and very close to the Hijaz also. Now the Qederites, we mentioned them before. The first mention of the Arabs was a tribe in the region of where the Qederites were. The Qederites were mentioned by the Assyrians for having a female queen, priestess, whatever you want to call it. In the biblical tradition, the Qederite named after Kedar, the second son of Ismail. Now, Muslim genealogists place great importance in this tribe because it was either Kedar or another son, Niboha, I think is pronounced, that they say that Rasulullah descended from. So they have an interest in knowing a lot about this tribe, preserving this tribe, any information they have regarding this tribe. And certainly it was one of the most, its oldest and largest of Arabian, like a confederate group of tribes working together. And they came into contact with the imperial powers of the Fertile Crescent in the north. It's mentioned, Kedar's mentioned in Genesis and Chronicles, and Queen Zabiba was one of the queens. Zabiba is raisin in the Arabic language. This is what Tabari calls her, although her name in the old language would have been somewhat different. So the kingdom of Kedar, now remember we call it a kingdom because that's the only way we know how to understand it, but it didn't function as a kingdom back then. From the 8th century BCE, so that's the earliest mention of this. Mamlakatu Kedar, as the Arabs say it, was a large nomadic ancient tribal confederation described as the most organized of the northern Arabian tribes. At the peak of its power in the 6th century BCE, it had a kingdom and controlled a vast region in Arabia. Allied with the Nabataeans at some point, likely absorbed into Nabataeans around the 2nd century. Now the Nabataeans are very interesting because the Nabataean legacy is the Arabian legacy as we know it today, but in ways of language. So by ways of language. And the Nabataeans and the Qederites were close. They were in proximity of each other, and one could have easily been absorbed into the other. And it seems like the Qederites were absorbed into the Nabataean tribes in the 2nd century. One famous queen, Zabiba, was a vassal to Taglath Pilsa III. We mentioned this in the stele. We saw this text. He gave her the title Queen of the Arabs. Sarat Arabi. He gave her this title. Biblical tradition holds that the Qederites are named from Kedar, the second son of Ismail, mentioned in the Bible book of Genesis and 1 Chronicles, where there is also a frequent reference to Kedar as a tribe. It's even mentioned in the old South Arabian inscriptions and classical Greek texts such as Herodotus, and Romans such as Pliny the Elder and Diodorus. So they mention this very famous tribe also. Herodotus documents that in classical antiquity they were called to assist Cambyses to help in invading Egypt in 525. So because their lands sit astride the gap between the Fertile Crescent and Egypt, and they were a large tribal confederation, Cambyses used their help in securing passage and as route masters, like planning out routes for them and showing them where water holes are and which way to go. And don't forget, it was these bigger tribes that would then talk to the other tribes and buy them off and say, do not attack, the armies are going to be passing, do not skirmish with us. So the Nabataeans and the Qederites together fought against the Assyrians, as we mentioned in the descriptions earlier. Pliny calls them Qederi and Qederani. He puts them next to the Nabatae. So Pliny in his geography places these two tribes next to each other. Jerome in 357 calls them Saracens, who are referred to as Ishmaelites in scripture. So he recognized them to be Arab, an Arab tribe, and Ishmaelites is another synonym for Arabs here. Herodotus described the relationship between the Qederites and the Persians as follows: they did not yield the obedience of slaves to the Persians, but were united to them by friendship for having given Cambyses passage into Egypt, which the Persians could not enter without the consent of the Arabs. So he's talking about a working relationship here now. There's a mutual trust and respect between both parties, and they have some sort of a relationship here, not as a vassal or tribute paying tribes like the others. Bible reference Isaiah. This is what the Lord says to me: within 1 year, as a servant bound by contract would count it, all the splendor of Kedar will come to an end. The survivors of the archers, the warriors of Kedar, will be few. The Lord, the God of Israel, has spoken. It's interesting the word archers is used here because Ismail was known as an archer, and this is one of the sons of Ismail. Isaiah 42 again: join in the chorus, your desert town. Let the villages of Kedar rejoice. Let the people of Selah sing for joy. Shout praises from the mountaintops. Again in Isaiah: all Kedar's flocks will be gathered to you. The rams of Nabataeans will serve you. They will be accepted as gifts on my altar, and I will adorn my glorious temple. Nabataeans is one of the other sons of Ismail, and the descent of Rasulullah, the Prophet of Islam, is either through Kedar or through this son. More likely it's through Kedar, but some do say it's through this son. In Jeremiah it's mentioned: cross over the coasts of Cyprus and look, send to Kedar and observe closely. See if there has ever been anything like this. Has a nation ever changed its gods? Yet they are not gods at all. But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, you heavens, and shudder with great horror, declares the Lord. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the springs of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. Again in Jeremiah, judgment on Kedar and Hazor. So again it's written concerning Kedar and the kingdoms of Hazor that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, struck down. Thus says the Lord: rise up, advance against Kedar, destroy the people of the east. Their tents and their flocks shall be taken, their curtains and all their goods, their camels shall be led away from them. So again we have the mention of tents and camels, which are synonymous with tent dwellers, camel breeders, Arabs. And men shall cry to them, terror on every side, flee, wander far away, dwell in the depths, O inhabitants of Hazor, declares the Lord. For Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylonia, has made a plan against you and formed a purpose against you. Rise up, advance against a nation at ease that dwells securely, declares the Lord, that has no gates or bars, that dwell alone. Their camels shall become plunder, their herds of livestock a spoil. I will scatter to every wind those who cut the corners of their hair, and I will bring their calamity from every side of them, declares the Lord. Hazor shall become a haunt of jackals, an everlasting waste. No man shall dwell there, no man shall sojourn in her. So a punishment is being warned against the Qederites and the Hazor people. Seems like the Lord isn't pleased with what they did, if there is truth in this story. Arabia and all the princes of Kedar were your customers. They did business with you in lambs, rams, and goats. In Ezekiel, this. Now there is a mausoleum in Iran, in the Zanjan province. It's visited by Christians, Muslims, and it's supposed to be the mausoleum of Kedar, the actual Kedar, the son of Ismail alayhi salam. But just like every other grave of every other prophet, we cannot say with certainty if there is any truth in this. The only grave that we know with certainty is the grave of the messenger of Islam, the final messenger, Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Ibn Kathir writes, all the Arabs of the Hijaz are descendants of Nabataeans and Qederites. So here Ibn Kathir is verifying, according to his understanding, that all of the Arabs descend from these two tribes. And we'll have a look at this further when we look at the Arab genealogy. Place names of Dumma and Taima or Tima also happen to be names of two of Ismail's sons. So Dumma, Dumat al-Jandal, which is the capital, which today is a city in Arabia, it was the capital, Dumma was the capital of the Qederites, was also a son of Ismail. And Taima, where Nabataeans spent 10 years, which is Tema, is also a son of Ismail. It has been suggested that the name is from Ismail's second son, Qeda, first attested in Assyrian in the 8th century BCE and Aramaic in the 6th century BCE. Its Aramaic transliteration is Qadarain. Qadran. Now again, we're looking at a word without vowels, so we don't know how to pronounce it exactly. It's Qdryn. Duma, as mentioned, the capital at Duma, which is modern Al-Jawf, Dumat al-Jandal. So it was an important route connecting Syria and the eastern Mesopotamia. Mentioned in the Assyrian text as Adamattu, as the seat of the confederation of Qeda and the base of their coat. This is what it looks like today, the ruins of the town, Dumat al-Jandal. And here is a map of its area of influence back in the day. So you could see it had encompassed a large territory. Then we move on to the Nabataeans. And the Nabataeans settled in the land of Edom. These are tribes. These are tribal confederations and small principalities and kingdoms like predating the Nabataeans. And they were conquered or made vassals by the Assyrians. And there's no need to mention them here because they're not really concerned our story. But the Nabataeans were roaming Arabs that eventually settled in that area. So they settled in the lands of Edom in North Arabia between the Dead and the Red Sea. The earliest reference is in 312 BCE, possibly much earlier, we don't know. Petra means rock. That's why when the three demarcations that the Romans had for the Arabian Peninsula, which was Arabia Felix, which was Fortunate Arabia, the south, Arabia Petrea, which was rocky Arabia, and Arabia Deserta, which was the desert. It grew rich on the spice trade. It was strategically placed on the northern end of the spice route just before Basra. So they competed, just like Dedan competed with Taima competed. Likewise, Basra and Petra competed together. It grew rich on the spice trade. Hegra and Madain Saleh was a part of the Nabataean realm. So we'll have a look at the Thamud and the story of Thamud later on. But what was left of those structures and those buildings were incorporated, were taken over by many other civilizations. One of them, the last one, were the Nabataeans. So some of the rock carvings are Nabataean and they look exactly the same as what you would see in Petra. Right? Petra's more famous. Hegra's not as famous for two reasons. One of them is that it was discouraged in the Sunnah from visiting those places, except to go through weepingly. And there's no doubt an understanding behind this we'll look at when we discuss Thamud. And another one is that the kingdom of Saudi Arabia didn't really encourage tourism up till last year, and it opened up its borders. It's got plans for it now, and then, as you know, we've been hit by this pandemic, so they've shut their borders again. So Arabic, which we'll again look at, the development of the Arabic language actually came to us via the Nabataeans. Again, it was always thought that the Arabic developed in the south and came up from there because we thought that the earliest Arabs were from there. But we know now today through the epigraphic record that the Arabic language actually developed in the north and moved down south. And it was the Nabataean script, it was the cursive Nabataean Aramaic that became Nabataean Arabic, and then it moved into the forms of Arabic, Hijazi Arabic, and from there we have its highest register, its most refined version, which is the Quran we have today. And it's a very interesting subject which we shall cover inshallah. Originally, desert nomads with Arabic roots, not Aramean. So even though they were in the Aramean sphere, like Palmyra was Aramean and mixed Arabs, the Nabataeans were not Arameans or from Edom or any of those places. They were Arabs. Many theories as to where they came from. We don't know enough where they came from, because obviously as wandering Arabs they could have come from anywhere. Yemen is postulated, or East, or the Hijaz. They share deities with North Arabs and Hijaz. This is another interesting subject when we discuss the different deities and the gods that the pre-Islamic Arabs used to worship. We'll look at this subject. So Diodorus mentions something about the Nabataeans. He says they live in the open air, claiming as native land a wilderness that has neither rivers nor abundant springs from which it is possible for a hostile army to obtain water. It is their custom neither to plant grain, set out any fruit-bearing tree, use wine, nor construct any house. And if anyone is found acting contrary to this, death is his penalty. They follow this custom because they believe that those who possess these things are, in order to retain the use of them, easily compelled by the powerful to do their bidding. Some of them raise camels, others sheep, pasturing them in the desert. They are exceptionally fond of freedom, and whenever a strong force of enemies comes near, they take refuge in the desert, using this as a fortress, for it lacks water and cannot be crossed by others. But to them alone, since they have prepared subterranean reservoirs lined with stucco, it furnishes safety. So this was a very early view of the Nabataeans. No doubt it's slightly exaggerated, but what he's trying to say here is they were very close to their Arabian nomadic roots. So they lived a nomadic lifestyle. They were very mobile, and their mode of living enabled them to be mobile so that nobody could overcome them. This is this account was of Diodorus Siculus, 80 to 20 BC. His chief source was the historian Hieronymus of Cardia, a high-ranking official in the court of Antigonus, one of the generals of Alexander the Great. So 3 centuries later, Strabo is mentioning the same people in a very different way. Let's see what he has to say. Strabo says, the metropolis of the Nabataeans is Petra, as it is called, for it lies on a site which is otherwise smooth and level, but it is fortified all around by a rock, the outside parts of the site being precipitous and sheer, and the inside parts having springs in abundance, both for domestic purposes and for watering gardens. Outside the circuit of the rock, most of the territory is desert, in particular that towards Judah. Here too is the shortest road to Jericho, a journey of 3 or 4 days, as also to the palm grove, the Tabuk region, a journey of 5 days. Petra is always ruled by some king from the royal family, and the king has an administrator, one of his companions, who is called brother. The Nabataeans are a sensible people and are so much inclined to acquire possessions that they publicly fine anyone who has diminished his possessions, and also confer honors on anyone who has increased them. So this is the exact opposite of what was said 3 centuries earlier. Since they have but few slaves, they are served by their kinsfolk for the most part, or by one another, or by themselves, and the customs extends to their kings. Their homes, through the use of stone, are costly, but on account of peace, the cities are not walled. Most of the country is well supplied with fruits, except the olive. They use sesame oil instead. The sheep are white fleeced, and the oxen are large, but the country produces no horses. Camels afford the service they require instead of horses. They go out without tunics, with girdles about their loins, and with slippers on their feet, even the kings, though in their case the color is purple. So the nearby Dead Sea produces asphalt in abundance, and from it they derived not a little revenue. Diodorus says this, but it was trade that made the Nabataeans famous, particularly in the luxury goods of southern Arabia. So it was on the trade route. Diodorus further says, while there are many Arabian tribes who use the desert as pasture, the Nabataeans far surpass the others in wealth, although they are not much more than 10,000 in number. For not a few of them are accustomed to bring down to the sea frankincense and myrrh and the most valuable kind of spices which they produce from those who convey them from what is called Arabia Felix. So 3 centuries apart, it's still known by its standing as a trade city. And here is a site in modern Saudi Arabia. It's one of their tombs, one of the buildings in Al-Higra Al-Ula in the Arabian Peninsula, far from their capital, which is in Petra to the north. Here is Petra. Here you can see Petra. And this is one of the, arguably the most famous example of their cultural heritage. And here's a map of their influence. So you can see it firmly in Jordan, and they, at its largest extent, it had the Sinai as well, and moving down towards northwest Arabia, encompassing the cities of Al-Ula, Didan, Taima, moving down towards Madain Saleh, which is close to Medina, Yathrib back then, and Khaybar.